Hi everyone. My name is John Vries. I am a director, writer, and producer, and also co-owner of a production company called TH Films, based here in Cape Town, South Africa. So first off, just want to say what an honor it is to be part of the summit, and my hope is that I can share just a little bit of the journey that God has taken me through in the film industry, and a little bit of what I've learned along the way. So what is media? I think we have a very narrow perspective, perhaps, on what media is. Maybe when we say the word, it conjures up pictures of the news, of magazines, and print media. But really, it encompasses everything that informs our culture. When we talk about media, we're talking about arts, we're talking about literature, we're talking about news media, print media, the works. It all encompasses in this thing we call media. And essentially what it is, it's the story of us. You know, if we go back to the origins of our civilization, the way that we kind of made sense of the world around us was around the campfire. You know, it was a community kind of wrestling with what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be a person, a human in this world? We're looking at the natural phenomena and trying to make sense of them in terms of spiritual and metaphysical contexts. And that journey, we have a little bit of it reflected on cave paintings, and we kind of see what early man was kind of going through, how they were wrestling with this idea of self, the idea of who am I in this world, who is God, you know, what is the natural world, how does it relate to me, what is the divine? And that story is what made us who we are today. The story was, who are we as a people? You know, who are we as a tribe? What are our moral norms? You know, what makes us us, and what makes them them, thinking of the other tribe. And that kind of started us on the journey of creating this kind of collective identity, the beginnings of culture, the beginning of what makes our tribe unique, what makes our people unique, what makes our language unique, what are our belief systems, you know, what are our values. And and those cave paintings give us a little glimpse into the everyday stories of these people, how they were wrestling with those ideas. So really what we have to do is to distill this idea of media into its core foundation, and that is just stories. It's how we have always made sense of the world. Those campfire stories and oral traditions, many of which have survived the millennia, have been the bedrock of our civilization. It's given us a sense of place, of belonging, and of meaning. The Christian religious art that we have today is a reflection of a time for centuries where, you know, our philosophy and our art and even our government was all channeled and funneled through a Christian worldview. And for a long time, the church was the curator of civilization, as it were. It helped us determine our values, our norms, our traditions, and dictated arts, dictated what was permissible, what wasn't. And it also kind of was a reflection of our journey, our collective journey of coming to terms with God, with us as a society. Our cultural identity, as it pertains to nationalism and pride and a sense of peoplehood, is also reflected through our art. Different images can conjure up different emotions. For an American, seeing the iconic painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware River can produce emotions of pride and nationalism and the sense of togetherness and hope in a fight for freedom. And those living under the Soviet Union, seeing, you know, the propaganda posters of togetherness, collectivism, and working together towards a common goal. And to some can even trigger memories of nostalgia, back to a simpler time, a time of great nationalist collectivist pride. And to some, a time of shame, where they look back at the Soviet past and the tragedy that it was for many. The modernization of media was really where we started to see a cultural transformation, a cultural revolution, as it were. Radio was one of the first instances where media was in the home. And back then it was a communal experience. You know, you had your family, your extended family, even your neighbors come, and everyone has this collective simultaneous experience where the broadcaster is putting out information or putting out audio stories, and everyone around you is experiencing the same thing at the same time. Whereas before, you would be reading print media, maybe media that's outdated, maybe of events that happened many, many months ago. But now you're giving society the ability to have this communal, instantaneous experience of world events in the home. And that was a very striking and pivotal moment for what will set the stage for the future of the transformation of society through media. Yeah, the radio was the new influencer. It helped to shape political opinions, and it had a profound effect on the psyche of society. Films in theaters and eventually TVs in homes marked another massive shift, where you started having a representation of kind of moral norms and dress and music and all these things entering the home. For some, it was a big boom. It was a remarkable achievement. For others, there was fear. My parents can tell me stories of how their parents rejected TV, rejected films, and refused to allow it in the home, just because they recognized the profound effect that it was having on culture and the rapid change that they just weren't grappling with. And they saw it as a secular influence in the home that had started replacing their own influence, and they weren't wrong. Maybe the collective rejection of it was a step in the wrong direction, but they weren't wrong about the profound power that media would have and was having on society. Society was changing faster than had ever happened before, and for the first time, TV was the main influencer in the house, and it started to affect the nuclear family, where it was a sort of the parents were the influencers in the house, but now it was the TV. And where TV became the authority, where your moral norms, your barometers were being reset to align with what was seen as norm on TV. And that was a massive change, and obviously it came with a large backlash from people, but largely it was embraced by society. Many people lived through what they saw on TV, these adventure films, going to exotic places they'd never go, experiencing things that they'd never experienced. This was a first, being able to experience this through your home. And it was hugely impactful. But still back then, theaters and TV were a communal experience. It was something that you shared with your family and friends or your group. It was something that you had a shared experience that you would talk about, that you would grapple with. Many Christians, realizing the missed opportunity of harnessing the power of media, kind of split the difference. There was a large retreating of Christians away from secular media, especially through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and a creation of a Christian subgenre, as it were, where they were trying to harness the power of media to spread the gospel, but also create a kind of a safe space for Christians to experience media that didn't compromise their moral norms. An interesting example of the power of media is Jaws in 1975, the great blockbuster. What was so interesting is the great psychological effect it had on society, especially in the West, where the fear of sharks that had never really entered into the consciousness of society was now front and center, and beach communities that depended on sort of holidaymakers going to the beach suddenly suffered greatly because people were too scared to go into the water. And following that, the deaths of sharks through competitive fishing and efforts to eradicate it for safety led to some shark populations declining by 80 to 90%. It was a massive overreaction, considering that you probably have a higher chance of dying falling out of bed than you do of a shark attack. But it just shows what a huge influence films can have on the psychology of society. More recently, we can look at the work of David Attenborough in Life on Our Planet, a Netflix documentary, showing the impact that humans are having on the climate and on the natural world, and the huge mass extinctions that are on our horizon, and looking at the social impact of those kind of documentaries, along with Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore, however you may feel about that. But there was a mass collective action based off of a sense of urgency and purpose through those documentaries, where people felt that they had a responsibility to act in order to save the natural world. And so films have an amazing effect on causing this collective activism and a collective sense of purpose. Now we have media on our phones, and where we came from media being a collective and communal experience to being a very individualistic experience, a very curated experience. And suddenly people are having unique experiences of similar media on their phones, on their tablets, on their devices, on their own. Today, targeted media is everywhere, on billboards, on magazines, on TV, on Facebook. It's everywhere. It's all around us, and we're being tracked. We're being studied, and they're trying to give us what they think that we want, based on our activities, based on our spending habits, and it's all based on race, religion, culture, region. And what it actually is doing, it's not only giving us what we want, but it's kind of starting to tell us what we want, and it's further dividing us into subcultures, into our own groups, and it's starting to create a massive divide in society. They're monetizing our desires, but at the same time, they are further stratifying the divides in our culture. Because let's be real, you're a product to these people. You're not just a person. And people sometimes talk about media as a mirror. It reflects back to us, the progress of society or the changes of society. But I would counter that and say it's much more than just a mirror. It is the great influencer. It is the great changer. It is the great mover and shaker of our modern age. So you take that influential power of media and then combine it with the targeted algorithms of YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, the places from which most people get their information these days, let's be real. And what you have is a divergent realities, where you have parallel realities where people can live in the same block, the same city, be part of a similar culture, and yet have completely different perspectives on the world. And will see the world, see society from completely different worldviews and lenses, even though they live in the same environment, because we're all consuming tailor-made media specific to us. Nothing is more telling of this than the current presidential election in the US, where, say, Donald Trump being a very divisive figure, you'll have half of the country hating him, seeing him as a dictator, seeing him as a loose cannon, wanting to remove him from office. And you have the other side of the country seeing him as the defender of democracy and would go to great lengths to secure a second term. And each side will be consuming different media that perpetuate a different perspective on the same thing, on the same political environment. You have two completely disparate perspectives. And it's a recipe for disaster, because we are a product of our lived reality, and that reality is shaped by the media that we consume, and that determines our worldview. An interesting example of that is when I tell people specifically from the West that I'm from South Africa. A lot of times their first questions are, do you have elephants walking around the streets? Do you have a pet lion? Do you live in a hut? Do you have roads? For those of us coming from Africa, it's hilarious because we come from a rapidly developing continent. But for those who have never experienced Africa, whose lived reality of Africa is only from the perspective of the media that they consume, for them it's just this deep, dark continent full of wild animals and huts. And that for them is the reality. And it's only because of the media that they've consumed that has shaped their perspective on Africa. And that extrapolates to the rest of their worldview as well. Now, a very telling effect of media on society is how it has shifted our cultural norms and values. And it's through a process called normalisation. So the way that that applies to the Christian worldview is, say that you have, as a society, a collective understanding and agreement of a certain intolerance towards a moral issue. Then, through the representation of that moral issue in media, a constant exposure to that moral issue, there is a general tolerance. So, although you don't accept or support that moral issue, you now tolerate its existence in the media. Over time, because you're constantly surrounded and influenced by that specific moral issue, now there's a general acceptance. We don't hate it, we don't necessarily like it. But we kind of just accept that it's part of our daily lives and it's just something we have to live with. Over time, society generally goes from a point of acceptance to realignment, where we came from totally rejecting and being intolerant towards that moral issue. Now we've internalized it and perpetuate it, and now it's part of our culture. So we not only accept it, but we support it, we perpetuate it, we fight for it, we champion it. And that process is sometimes cyclical, so we can go from intolerance to realignment and then way back to intolerance again. And that process used to take quite a long time for society to go from intolerance to realignment. But now, as we've seen, that process can take little as 5 years for us to go from completely rejecting and being intolerant towards something and accepting it and perpetuating it as part of our society's norms and values. So what does that mean for us as Christians, where there are certain moral norms or things that we reject as Christians that now become part of society? What does that mean? What does that look like? For me, it instills a sense of urgency for Christians to once again be at the front and center of that point of influence in society where we can normalize virtue. If you're thinking about all the things that we're grappling with as a society, racial injustice, violence, income inequality, climate change, all these things that we're struggling and having discourse about. Imagine Christians normalizing virtue in those situations where we take the fore, we're able to take over the airwaves, as it were, and normalize virtue in the midst of these crises that society is dealing with. And I think that right there is the call for us in the industry. The Christian response to this has largely been in the form of creating Christian media. That's created sort of a Christian subculture within the greater culture. And that's in the form of music, written works, and visual media like films and TV. And so it's twofold. So obviously on the surface, the desire is to create works that reach out to the world, that are vehicles for the gospel to reach the world. But largely, Christian media has been produced for consumption by Christians. While there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that, edifying the church is incredibly important, and encouraging the church through media that helps to encourage us is incredibly helpful. But the problem is that what happens when Christians become irrelevant in the world? What happens when we don't have a voice anymore in the secular media environment? Because let's be real, the greatest influencer is the secular media environment. And so I think the danger is creating an insular environment where we make media for ourselves and for our own consumption, but lose out on being the great influencer in the world and being relevant in the conversation in the secular media. And that right there is the big wrestling point for us as Christian content creators, is how do we be relevant in the secular industry whilst not compromising on our Christian values? So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the concept of the mountains of influence. And the mountains of media and arts and entertainment, which kind of work together, are the great influences of this generation. It basically is the plumb line by which society determines its moral norms, its values, its virtues. Our spending habits, everything is determined by what we see on TV. And more than ever, the younger generations are being influenced by what they see. We are, after all, tribal in our nature. I mean, we were talking about earlier about our ancestors, our cavemen ancestors. And for them, this collective identity of kind of making sense of us as a group and them as a group is largely reinforced by the collective values and understanding of what it means to be part of a society. And that hasn't changed. I mean, although technology has changed very rapidly, our brains haven't really changed at all. We're still very much those tribal people that sat in caves and made cave paintings trying to make sense of the world. And nowadays, those discussions are being had for us. And for the most part, we accept those discussions because we want to be part of the collective. We want to be part of society. It's how we're wired. We want to relate to each other on similar grounds. And now it's starting to be dictated to us, and that's a very dangerous place to be. And more than ever, the Christian voice is desperately needed in that space. So how do we redeem the process? How do we remain relevant as Christian content creators and influencers in other sectors as well? So for us, I've broken it down into 5 steps that relate to us as in the film industry, but it can probably apply to pretty much anything else. So the first starting point for any media project is having a compelling story. How do we relate to the audience? And I think that's the starting point, is creating an incubator for stories that align with our values, norms, and objectives, but also at the same time hold true to telling compelling stories that the audience really wants to watch and consume and engage with. I think all too often Christian stories have started with a message, tried to build a story that is a vehicle for that message to get out, but in the process not only lose out on the story and create a vehicle that is subpar, but also comes across more as propaganda rather than a compelling story that people can relate to. So it's about telling excellent, compelling, thoughtful stories that are real, that are gritty, that people can relate to, and that are marketable. And I think that's the real challenge for us as Christians in the industry, is how do we tell stories that are marketable, but at the same time not compromise on our values? And I think that is the great question for us right now. A great example of this are the allegories told by C.S. Lewis and Tolkien in their fantasy worlds that they created in the Chronicles of Narnia and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It's so indicative of taking our Christian worldview but making excellent content that is relevant to the world and everyone can relate to and can be successes. And that's the kind of stories that we need to be telling, things that people actually want to consume. The next question is, how do we redeem the production process? The film industry is based on hierarchies. It's based on very shady business tactics and processes. So how do we take that and redeem that process as Christians? For us, it's about treating people with respect, no matter the station. From the lead actors all the way down to the runners and the personal assistants. It's treating everyone with respect as people created in the image of God. It's paying people properly. It's creating safe working environments. It's making sure that productions are a place where people feel safe, that people aren't exploited, and that we're living out our values as Christians in the production process that are on par, if not above and beyond anything that the world can throw at us. We should also be redeeming the infrastructure surrounding film and media and every other sector when it comes to every part of the production chain, whether it comes to the studios, whether it comes to the gear, whatever. We should be the big influencers. We should be the thought leaders, the business leaders, the innovators. We should be the ones right at the forefront of creating innovative infrastructure around media. And we should be the ones that are curating and pushing forward technological developments. And that makes us even more relevant going forward. We should be the great influencers in this process. And one of the biggest hurdles as Christian independent content creators, but any independent content creator can tell you, is that financing and getting a hold of financing to make projects is often the biggest hurdle. So if we can create a financial pool through which Christian aligned media can be made, that already solves half of the problem. All too often we have these stories, these incredible stories through our Christian experience and our lived experience, but they can't be made because there's just no money, or there's no money to be made properly. So the only way we can compete on the same level as everything else out there, the marvels of the world, is create a financial pipeline through which Christian and Christian-aligned content can be made. And that is half the battle. Another big challenge is, how do we get our content to the masses? A lot of times, distribution channels and streaming channels have kind of been looking for content that is antagonistic towards Christian values and norms or virtues. And so how do we create a platform and a conduit through which Christian and Christian-aligned content can get to the audiences that we are looking for? How do we reach them? And that's part of the conversation. How do we redeem the distribution process to a point where we're able to create that pipeline that is easily accessible by the consumers? If we want to be the great influencers of the generation, that we not only need to come up with great ideas, but we need to own the process. We need to be able to get our media out there and engage with the world in a level that is excellent, that is on the same level, if not exceeding what is out there in the world. We should be the innovators. We should be out there in the forefront making the best, most engaging content there is on the planet. We need to be the salt and light. We need to be changing the culture from the inside and the outside. We need to be relevant, and that is our challenge. In 2012, when a friend of mine and I started TH Films, our hope was to create a banner to which like-minded individuals, like-minded content creators can rally and make the kind of content that we believe in. We were dissatisfied with not only the content that was out there that was in opposition to our values, but we were also dissatisfied with the process. We were seeing an industry that exploits, that abuses, that put people in harsh and dangerous working environments, all about getting the bottom line. And we wanted to make a difference. We started the company with no money, but a determination to make the kind of content that we wanted to see out there. And through God's grace and hard work, we've been able to make an award-winning company, and we're able to make the kind of content that we believe in, that we believe can make a difference in the world. But not only that, but also gives us the opportunity to show the industry that there is another way. There's a way to make content in a way that glorifies God, that lives up to our Christian values, and helps transform the world from the inside out. I want to leave off with a challenge, and this is for myself as much as anyone else out there, is that those of us as Christians in industries, whether it be film, healthcare, education, government, business, those are our spheres of influence. And it's up to us to redeem those spheres. For all too long, Christians have looked at the world around us that's darkening by the day, and we retreat. We retreat in the places that we feel comfortable, the environments that we feel comfortable, and we've created a safe space for us while the world around us crumbles. And my challenge to us is to turn around and look at how can we be relevant in the world right now that is desperately needing our message, that desperately needs what we have, that we take the fore, that we are the tip of the spear, that we work to be the best of the best in excellence, to be the innovators, to be the game changers, to be the influencers, because the world is so desperate for the message that we have. And the task that's been given to us is so great to spread the message of hope that we have. But we're not going to get there until we are the influencers, until we are the heartbeat of the industry, until we're normalizing virtue as it aligns to our Christian worldview. So that's where I want to end off, to just challenge us to go out there, to be relevant, to get out of our comfort zones and make a difference in a world that so desperately needs the message that we have.